Hello, and welcome to a paraprofessional training entitled Trauma Informed Care. My name is Doreen Milet, and I am one of the training and consultative staff in the Schuylkill IU 29 Special Education Department. Our topics for this session are the following. I want you to understand some key trauma-related concepts. I want you to understand trauma's effects on behavior. I would like to share with you 6 guiding principles to a trauma-informed approach. I would like to help you create a compassionate classroom, and I would like to mention de-escalation. Experiencing a trauma can change the way a person perceives the world. I just would like you to take a second to think about whether you yourself have experienced any type of trauma in your life, or perhaps you know people that have. More and more of our society and our people in our world are doing this on a daily basis. And it can really just change the way that you are, how you feel, what you do on a day-to-day basis. And what we need to acknowledge is that the students that are coming to us and we are supporting every day in classrooms are experiencing trauma as well. Whether trauma is caused by a single event, such as a natural disaster, like a tornado or an earthquake, or by repeated or prolonged exposure to abuse, an individual's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are filtered through that experience and perspective. So trauma can be something that happens in nature, that happens to us. A fire, a house burned down, which is something I experienced in my childhood. It could be a weather-related natural disaster. If we think about, it could be war, it could be many different things that happen as a natural part of our world. Or it can be that prolonged exposure to verbal, physical, mental, emotional abuse done by another individual to us. And when those things happen, it definitely impacts who we are and how we respond to our world. So if you think about your role in the classroom as a paraprofessional, my role in my world as, personal world and professional world, what we want to do is we want to flip a little bit, because we are realizing that more and more of our youth are dealing with trauma, many types of trauma, as a matter of fact. And we as individuals are also dealing with trauma. So having a trauma-informed perspective means that I start asking or behaving in a way that lets the person know I'm curious about what happened to you. Instead of thinking something's wrong with you. Um, so if you think about your interactions with youth on a day-to-day basis, or even interactions with the professionals that you work side by side with, do you approach them with a feeling, with a mannerism where you're empathetic and you're asking like what happened to them, instead of treating them as if something is wrong with them? And I don't necessarily mean that you're going to out loud say what happened to you, because that could be very traumatic for that individual to explain. And hopefully they're maybe getting some type of counseling or some type of help dealing with it. But just the way that you are as a person, that you're the kind of compassionate, empathetic person, that you're giving them that feeling of there's nothing wrong with them, that they're not doing something bad, that you understand that something may have happened to them that would have been traumatic, and that you're curious about that and helping them to get through it. So trauma, I'd like some definitions. Trauma itself is defined as an emotional response to a terrible event. So it could be immediate, and you could have long-term reactions to it. Um, Trauma-informed care is a framework of thinking and of interventions that you would provide to help a person be cared for after experiencing that emotional response. And a trigger is a trigger is a signal that acts as a sign of possible danger, which then leads to a response. So there could be something, for example, I mentioned in a moment ago that when I was younger, uh, our family home, burned, and we lost everything in that fire. To this day, I love campfires. I totally love sitting by a campfire, roasting marshmallows and hot dogs and enjoying the fire. And there's no trigger with that. But if I go near a burnt building or a burned home after the fire has occurred, that smell of that burnt building or the burnt home triggers a very traumatic response from me because I remember that smell. But I can sit by a campfire and enjoy a campfire because it's not the same. So, what we have to do is realize that our children that we're supervising and even the adults we work with, there are certain triggers that happen. And even though we're not being threatened with trauma at that moment, the trigger could cause a reaction. And what we want to do is try to help that youth come up with some ways to deal and cope positively with those triggers. So there are different levels of trauma per se. So we're going to talk about acute trauma. So acute trauma means that you've been exposed to a single overwhelming event. Okay. So examples could be rape, the death of a loved one, a natural disaster. So some characteristics of having dealt with an acute trauma would be that you have a very detailed memory of that overwhelming event. There could be some omens associated with it. Hypervigilance, which means you're like just hyper vigilant about the event and anything related to it. You could have an exaggerated startle response. So, like, let's say there was a rape involved. You could have the next time a male person, if you're a female and you're raped, if a male touches you, you could have like a really exaggerated response to like jerking away because of that overwhelming event that you experienced. And you could have a misperception or an overreaction as things happen. So things that are happening currently could be tied back to that acute trauma you experienced. Chronic trauma is extended exposure to the traumatizing event, not just that single event, but extended exposure. So examples of chronic trauma would be prolonged exposure to violence or bullying. And that could be in the school environment, in the home environment, a combination of both. Another example is profound neglect. If you are if you're not getting the things that you need to sustain yourself as a human being. It could be a series of home removals that you don't have the stability of returning to a home on an ongoing basis, that you've been moving around and very transient. So those are examples of chronic trauma. And characteristics of someone that has experienced a chronic trauma would become this like denial or the psychological numbing. Like you just begin to the safest thing for you to do is just become numb, to deny that anything's happening and just become numb to it, that you're okay. You don't let anything hurt you. Disassociation means you kind of just detach yourself from everything. So if I'm not connected to anything, then things can't bother me. So you could be having students could be doing this disassociation. They could act out in rage. which means very, very aggressive anger and just rage reactions. You could socially withdraw from things. It's safer to just not be involved. And you could just have a sense of a foreshortened future. You're not looking forward. You're not thinking of the future. You're not happy about the future or planning because you just think it's going to be more traumatizing situations. Complex trauma is a single traumatic event that is devastating enough to have long-term effects. So some examples of a complex trauma would be a mass casualty at a school shooting, a car accident with fatalities, maybe refugee dislocation, meaning that you have been displaced from your country of birth or origin, and you are now living in a totally different location, not by choice, but for your safety. Um, there's been a lot going on in our current society with the school shootings. Recently, I've heard on the news about students that are in a college setting that were involved in a mass shooting at the college setting, and these are students that were involved in a shooting at an elementary or a high school setting. So this youth has experienced two mass shootings at school. So talk about complex trauma. So what happens with someone that has experienced complex trauma is that they can be in this perpetual mourning or depression phase. Like they don't come out of it. They could actually be physically experiencing chronic pain. The effects of it could be that much that they actually have that chronic pain. They could definitely have concentration problems because they're so focused and so in tune with the trauma they've experienced that they could begin not being able to concentrate. They could have sleep disturbances. They're not able to get enough rest. So all of these things can definitely have an effect on their school performance or their performance in school. And they could be very irritable. So these are things that the actual event is causing. The traumatization occurs when you have internal, so you're inside, or external, so the things outside, resources that are inadequate for coping. There are people that have gone through these traumatic events, but because of their healthy coping mechanisms, they are able to find a healthy way to cope, and they are able to function successfully in their lives. Traumatization is when your resources for coping are inadequate. So that is when your outside supports, like you as a paraprofessional, can help an individual with those coping skills. So some guiding principles for a trauma-informed care would be, number one, that there's safety involved, that the students feel physically and mentally safe. So when they come in to your setting and you're with them, what things that you can do to make them feel safe and secure. Number two is trustworthiness and transparency, so that you begin to establish a relationship that the student or the youth feels that they can trust you with what they have been experiencing. Transparency deals with that you're not trying to be secretive, that you're being very transparent with your desire to help them, and that they would feel the ability to be transparent with their feelings of what trauma they've lived through. Peer support deals with, do you have peers, meaning your same age type people that are there to support you? So you could help build that with other youth. You could be that peer support for your professional colleagues that you have. Number four is collaboration and mutuality. So you're working together and you have mutual benefit in that relationship. Number five is empowerment and choice. So what can we do to make students feel that they have power and they have choice, that they can be built up, that they can be strong enough to cope with these feelings and with these triggers. And then you have to recognize that there are cultural, historical, and gender issues involved in all of the trauma-informed care. So all of these guiding principles require constant attention. They require caring awareness. They require sensitivity and possibly a cultural change. It is possible that the environment that we're working in doesn't possess all of these guiding principles. So what can we do as individuals of a place, of a school, to try to build those principles into our systems? So here are some do's and don'ts of a trauma-informed, compassionate classroom. Okay, so one of the first things you can do is have a consistent schedule and help students prepare for transitions. Because as I mentioned before, trauma could be something that is triggered by events. So if we have a predictable routine in our settings, it really does help our youth to anticipate. And sometimes when we have to change that routine, as long as you explain why it's being changed, that usually is fine. Preparing them for those fire drills, preparing them for different situations that may happen. Maybe the regular teacher is out sick, so there's a substitute teacher. So preparing the students for those changes to try to avoid those triggers. If you follow through with your promises and explain changes, you would be working to build a sense of trust with the students and your colleagues. If we try to power with students rather than power over them, like think about what you feel like when someone is looking over you or controlling what you do, as opposed to you coming to an agreement with each other and offering choices, and you can do this if you do this. Here are your two choices, you pick the one you want. So rather than that power over, but letting them have some choice. And then staying regulated. So if something is happening that the student is feeling, having some effects from that trauma, does it help them to take deep breaths? Does it help them to go for a walk? Does it help them to get fresh air? Does it help them to lay their head down? Does it help them to punch a pillow? Does it help them to yell? And understanding what are those things that help me to cope with trauma, and then making sure that we have an environment set up that they can do that. So if they need to punch something, where can we take them, or where could they safely do that without hurting another person or themselves? If they need fresh air, can we make that happen? Can they go out? Can they get a breath of fresh air and then come back and return? So helping them to understand first what helps them feel better, because they may not know that. You might have to help them to know that. And then making sure that those things are ready for them and at their disposal. The worst thing that we could do is punish a youth for behaviors that are related to trauma. Okay, so if something traumatic happened to them and a trigger sets them off, the worst thing we could do is punish them for that. We need to talk about what happened. We need to identify the trigger. We need to change the setting, change the environment, change the behavior, and help them to get regulated again. So de-escalation, if you think of escalating means like to go faster, okay? So, or to go up, things like that. So we want to de-escalate. We want to calm down. So what we need to do is have some prevention tools to help avert difficult behaviors. And we want to try to avoid restraining and secluding students, especially if their behavior is tied to a traumatic response or a traumatic event. So again, like I said before, we want to help the youth learn and become aware of the triggers and the people and things that help them feel better when they're having a hard time. So what you could do is you could sit down and you could make a list of the people and the things that the student identifies as being helpful. When I'm feeling panicked, this is what I need to do. I need to take deep breaths. It helps me to read a book. It helps me to talk to a certain person. And you make a list of those things. And then when you notice that there could be something brewing, we offer that list to them and we say, okay, which one would you like to try? Well, how about you do this? How about we do this? And you just make those de-escalation things happen. So here are some alternatives that you can possibly prevent. If you Google it, you'll find many others, and it could be something that's not even on any list. It could be something the student just has discovered. So things like listening to music, holding someone's hand, pounding some clay. Maybe they need to play a computer game, putting ice on the body. So getting an ice cube and just rubbing it on a part of their body that might help them. Being wrapped tightly in a blanket or using a weighted vest. I like this one too. It says voluntary time in a quiet room, because remember the slide before, I said don't seclude them unless that's their coping strategy. So if being alone in a quiet space is what they've identified as being helpful, then that's okay. But don't make it feel like it's a punishment to get them away from everybody. So the information that I presented was from a couple different resources. One of them is www.crisisprevention.com, also echoparenting.org, and on the Patton website, pattan.net, there is a video with that is about connections between trauma-informed practices and care. So you can check out any of those things to learn more. But it is really, really important that we acknowledge that more and more of our youth are coming to us having experienced multiple trauma, multiple types of trauma, and they may or may not have the coping strategies that you and I perhaps have. So that we have to work with them and try to do that. So I hope this session has been helpful. Again, there is one of the anticipatory guides for you to complete in order to get credit for this session. Thank you and have a great day.